Kathy, great to see you. So we're waiting for Ana Maria, who will launch the proceedings, but we are delighted to have you all here.
I am ready. It's great to see all of you here. So good morning and good afternoon to all of you from UNESCO Paris. And we are very happy to welcome you to this very first edition of UNESCO's series of regional expert consultations against gender stereotypes with the aim to change mindsets and norms. And this first session is focusing on North America. My name is Anna Maria Meilev and I work for the Inclusion and Rights section at UNESCO. Let me first of all remind you that English and French interpretation is available during this online meeting by clicking on the globe on your screen. And since we don't have much time, let me now introduce you to Gabriela Ramos, our Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences, who will both deliver the opening remarks and also set the agenda. And she will be followed by our moderator, Tim Shand. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ana Maria. And what better to do in a gloomy day in Paris than just getting together with you to really pick up your brain into something that UNESCO is trying to advance, which is a very concrete proposal to advance gender equality. Of course, we are in the year that, due to the pandemic, the generation equality meetings have been moved, but the year that, given the impact of the crisis on this agenda, we are with renewed efforts to try to deliver better for women. And I want to thank you all for joining us. Of course, Tim, who is partnering with us to advance this agenda, but also Catherine, Durba, Umberto, Julie, and Mishwana. Great to have you in these consultations. We will be doing consultations on a regional basis every Monday and every Thursday. We are bringing leaders from all around the world to reflect on the progress made in the gender equality agenda, but also on the features of that agenda that seem to be so difficult to tackle. And one of the areas in which we really want to make progress is the question of stereotyping, gender norms, cultural norms, that then reflect themselves into institutional and legal frameworks that just reproduce how unequal the outcomes are. So it's great to have you here. The context, as usual, can be other than the pandemic. It's just natural that the differentiated impact or the exacerbation of inequalities have also a gender angle, a very strong gender angle. And this is nothing more than the fact that some of the groups of our people, some of the countries, some of the governments better prepared to waive the impact of the pandemic, and some others were not. And unfortunately, we see that the greatest burden of this shockwave that we have experienced have also been felt, I would say, in a very determined way by women, because of course this is known now for everybody. Women have been at the forefront of the fight against the pandemic and at the forefront of keeping the economy and society moving differently from other crises, even the stock exchange crash or the financial sector crisis in 2008. This crisis is not only calling women professions to face the pandemic in terms of the nurses, in terms of the school teachers, in terms of the care economy, but it's also affecting those sectors where women are overrepresented, which are the services sector, the tourism, entertainment, and therefore it has been really very, very, very clear hit in terms of the ecosystems in which women are overrepresented. Now, because we are doing this reflection for North America, Labor figures that were released last week for December confirm the issue that the job losses were way higher for women than for men in the US. And there has been a destruction that had been massive, both of them. And I think that the fact that the governments are really putting together packages for supporting these jobs is a great news. But the fact that 4.4 million have been lost for male and 5.4 for women, these are the census numbers, which is telling us really that women, again, are really being affected much wider. But then we go on in terms of how many institutions are documenting the differentiated positioning of women and the gender agenda. And I'm sure you all got to see the Gates report regarding women and the crisis, and also the how we picture this crisis in media, and how much women are only called to be exposed as victims and not as experts. And also how many of the task forces that governments have created to counter the pandemic or take decisions regarding the pandemic, women are really underrepresented. So I feel it's time to look at these issues closely and to see how can we continue pushing for the agenda that we all have been posing for years in terms of advancing very concrete legislating equality, developing institutions to push equality, and also controlling the downside, but where there is a sense of urgency to not only look at the effectiveness of these measures and how more we can do, but also to counter the more striking downwards impacts of the crisis. The worst of it, we are also joining forces and voices with many other institutions that have called, in particular friends in the UN Women, that have signaled how much women are now even suffering in terms of their physical integrity due to the increased violence against women, men violence against women, as they say. And the fact that it has grown for 30%, 40%, 50%, depending on the countries, but everywhere around the world, it has increased. And this is just another signal of what is wrong in our societies if these things continue to happen, and they're seen as family issues. In Paris, we had a demonstration this weekend where young girls and manifestants were saying this cannot be a family issue, and this is a fact, this is a crime, and that we need to pursue it. We know that, for example, domestic violence rose at an alarming rate across the globe, increasing in South Carolina was 35%. In Canada, fear, stigma, xenophobia place marginalized and indigenous women at increased risk of violence. And in some parts of the world, there was an upsurge of 70%, even as 70%, as I said. So this is the context in which we are. And what we call is to have a whole of government, whole of society approaches to look at the legal frameworks and those that are more effective, to look at the transformative policies, benchmark, affirmative action, public and private sector synergies and incentives. And all of these we are going to bring together, because what we want to hear from you is what works. What do you think could be replicated? What can help us room for that there are instruments and there are inventions that are delivering better on this agenda, that UNESCO could bring together for a roadmap that we are producing on these areas. And of course, we cannot be driven only by the most worrisome facts. We know that progress is there. We know that new generations are behaving differently from older generations. We know that at the beginning of the 21st century in Canada and the US, women were even second-class citizens by law, and at least it's not by law nowadays. They could not vote, could not obtain a degree, they could not open a bank account without the permission of their partners. But these things have changed, and I think that these regions have promoted really advancements of a feminist agenda and a gender-based agenda that is really important. Securing rights, securing equity, securing reproductive health and rights, LGBT rights, and then of course fostering girls' education and include women's voices in organizations in leadership position. But as I say, these progress, which are welcome, are not yet for us to consider that the task is done, because it's not. We still, and I don't know why, we are still having 15% gap in the wage gap. Equal job, we still have this gap even in the most advanced economies, in countries where we can measure it. But in developing countries and low-income countries, we know that women are overrepresented in the informal economy, and therefore their conditions of work are of much lower quality. In the US, 2018, women earned 82 cents for every dollar earned by men. And the wage gap, of course, deepens for women of color. Black women earn 62 cents for every dollar earned by men. Native American, 57, and Latinas, 54.7. So this is a picture that we don't like. And this is a picture that we at UNESCO are really trying to change. And as I said, we have a lot of tools, a lot of interventions, a lot of good policies. But we know that if we don't change the mindset, if we don't change the cultural norms and stereotypes, this is going to progress very slow, which has been the case in the last decades. So we need to tell our girls that this is not enough. Not enough, for instance, that in STEM, we still are talking about the lower representation of girls. At UNESCO, we are advancing a recommendation on ethics of artificial intelligence. And again, one very strong chapter is on girls, because they are underrepresented in this impressive world of technology that is recreating the world in so many ways. And of course, the different areas in which women are really present as they should. And so we're gonna advance this flagship program. And we are gonna examine it and eliminate the origins, consequences of harmful gender stereotypes, so they no longer hold sway over our lives and successes, and also help us to eliminate those areas in which restrict the freedoms, identities, opportunities, and if it hurts our economies. We're going to be partnering, for example, with Promundo, who developed this analytical piece that tells us that masculine stereotypes to act, thought, or map up, slow down innovation and cost over $15 billion a year. So it's a women's rights perspective. It's a girl's self-esteem, confidence, leadership that we want to encourage. Is the gender stereotype that creates all this unequal world in which we live. So we will be advancing this agenda. We really are so glad to open discussion with the regional consultation in North America. And then, of course, we are going to be partnering with our UNESCO chairs, with our inclusive cities, sports organizations, youth leaders, scientists, and key experts. And we're developing awareness raising campaigns and groundbreaking research projects, spanning from the Men for Gender Equality initiatives to the master classes against racism and discrimination, and the intercultural competencies framework. And as I said, the recommendation on artificial intelligence. We have been pushing also many other discussions, the elimination of violence. I think this is something that should get us together. But the call today is how do we advance a real agenda to counter these stereotypes, to counter these cultural norms, and to create a wide network of role models and leaders paving the way against harmful gender stereotypes and norms. And this goes from the business sector, it goes from the public sector, and it goes from so many other areas in which we need to change the script. I know that this is about people. And this is about people like you that join us in this effort, but also remembering wonderful women and wonderful men that have pushed this agenda forward. We were thinking about my sector, the social and science sector, is also the sector in UNESCO that is dealing with sports. And we were just thinking that in 1966, Roberta Keefe became the first female finisher of the Boston Marathon. And you know all these images where she's trying to jump and then the director of the marathon tries to take her out and there is another man who is supporting her. It's just amazing, but it was just 50 years ago. And therefore, this is amazing that it was only on 1994, I think. And it was another American lady who won the marathon, the very first time that the marathon was approved for women in the Olympics. Catherine Switzer, a year later in 1966, registered officially using her initial instead of her full name and also finished the marathon despite attempts to remove her. And it's amazing because she ran 50 years later in 2017 at the age of 70, and this time along with 12,000 other women. So we feel that these are the stories we can share. These are the stories that can make us advance this agenda. And that's why we are so glad that you join us today. We will consult with you, but we'll also keep you posted with the progress that we will make in this program. And we hope that this is just the beginning of a wonderful partnership to advance better for women going forward. So thank you for joining us. And team, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, for those very inspiring opening remarks. And thank you all for joining. It's a real privilege for me to moderate this discussion. I've worked in gender and researched in gender equality for about 20 years. I had the privilege of working in the US, both for Georgetown University and Promundo, and studied in Canada. So it's really great to be with our friends in North America as part of this conversation. Just want to emphasize one point that Gabriela mentioned in terms of this being part of a broader flagship program for UNESCO, where really it's a journey that UNESCO's on as part of its key focus and priority on gender equality, which it's had for over 10 years, to really think with you and to learn from you and to build on the existing initiatives. And as Gabriela mentioned, though this is the beginning of 6 regional consultations, there will then also be a flagship research report that we're developing. We will develop a network of role models and leaders that we hope to advance this case, and then a global advocacy campaign to strengthen existing endeavours and foster lasting change. And we would be thrilled to engage all of you on this call. We've now got almost 100 participants, and this is the beginning of a very exciting journey. So thank you. Let me say a word about the format before I introduce the fantastic panel that we have for this conversation that we're very grateful has taken time to join us. I'll begin with an interactive discussion with the panel, and that will last probably for about 30 to 40 minutes. We'll then open up for Q&A with those who are attending. You'll notice that there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please use that. We will monitor that and we will feed back questions to everyone. And then we'll return to the way forwards, really emphasizing Anna Maria and Gabriela's remarks around what can UNESCO do to advance this critical issue. Over time, it's always been a critical issue, but especially given the multitude of challenges that we face. And then we'll wrap up with next steps. I want to emphasize that we really want this to be participatory. We will collect all the inputs from the chat box. I see some people have already introduced themselves. During the discussion that I'm about to have with the panel, if you have particular thoughts around the challenges relating to gender stereotypes, gender norms, many of the issues that Gabriela mentioned, then please share your thoughts on the chat box. Please also share your thoughts on any initiatives that you are aware of in this area that we really want to engage with and learn from. And then at the end, I'll also ask everyone on this call for their views about recommendations on the way forward. We have limited time, we can't cover everything, but we will make sure that your voice is heard from whatever you share with us in the chat function. So let's turn to the fantastic panel that we have. Let me introduce each of them. Firstly, Kathy Feingold is Deputy Director of the International Trade Union Confederation. She's a leading advocate on grassroots and global workers' rights issues and has over 20 years experience in trade union rights, gender equality, women's rights, and global economic justice, including the working conditions of domestic, migrant, and informal economy workers. Kathy has to leave us early, and so we will turn to you first, Kathy, in terms of the questions. Durba Mitra is Assistant Professor of Women, Gender and Sexuality at Harvard University. She works at the intersection of feminist and queer studies, and her research and teaching focuses on the history of sexuality, the history of science and epistemology, and gender and feminist thought in South Asia and the colonial and post-colonial world. Umberto Carollo is the Executive Director of White Ribbon and co-chair of the Board of Directors of the Global Men Engage Alliance. He is a gender-based violence specialist with 20 years experience in gender equality, human rights, HIV, LGBTQ, advocacy, community development, and multi-sectoral partnerships. Julie Goldscheid is Professor of Law at SUNY School of Law, where she has helped develop the Family Law Practice Clinic. She teaches and researches on civil procedure, lawyering, gender and law, gender-based violence, and economic equality. And her litigation and policy work has included defending the 1994 Violence Against Women Act in courts across the US. Mishana Goman Tanawanda Band of Seneca is Associate Professor of Gender Studies and Chair of the American Indian Studies Interdepartmental Program at UCLA, and Special Advisor to the Chancellor on Native American and Indigenous Affairs. She grew up on the East Coast, traveling the paths of her iron worker father before returning to the sunnier parts of California. Welcome to you all, and thank you again for joining us. Let me remind the speakers that we would love you to keep to 3 minutes if you can in your remarks. Kathy, I'm going to turn to you first. What are the main issues and stereotypes in the North America region, in your view, and how in particular do you think COVID-19 has exacerbated or impacted on those?
Thanks so much, Tim, and thanks to everyone. Great to see Gabriella and this great panel. Thanks for having me here. And I just want to also emphasize I'm representing the US labor movement as well as the global labor movement here today. We represent, we'd like to say we're one of the largest working women organizations in the US. So this is such an important conversation for us. We have to situate this in the current moment, obviously, because the labor movement has always worked to ensure that everyone can work with safety, equality, and dignity, free from harassment and discrimination. And what we are seeing with COVID-19 is it has really exposed and exacerbated the existing inequities and economic insecurities that workers are facing. And we've also seen, as Gabriella rightfully pointed out, increased harassment and violence at home and in the workplaces. We also have heard in the latest numbers that came out just last week that the impact is disproportionately falling on Black and Latina women in particular. And then I know we will hear about Native American communities as well as being disproportionately impacted. Women in low-paid frontline jobs are feeling it. They have been facing heightened risk of job loss. They're more desperate often to keep a paycheck at any cost. And that means that often they're less willing to report discrimination, harassment, and increasing assault and abuse at work. So what we really identify this as an issue of power imbalance. And so the labor movement says, well, if there is this power imbalance in the workplace, if workers, because of their gender, and we have to talk about the intersections of race and gender, sexual orientation, immigration status, if workers feel like they don't have the power to speak out about discriminatory behavior, about violence in the workplace, then those systemic problems won't stop. And so one of the very concrete recommendations that we have is you need to reform labor laws. And in the US in particular, that is one of the main campaigns that the labor movement has. If workers are whether you're a domestic worker or an agriculture worker that actually doesn't receive the same protections under our labor law due to histories of racism and exclusion of labor policy, then we need to have a labor law that is inclusive of all workers, protects all workers. One of the big issues in our country right now that is, I think, putting in jeopardy working people, and especially women, is the misclassification of workers, right? There is a struggle of how many workers can we exclude from protections. And so what the labor, I would say the number one recommendation we have is, if you are going to deal with systemic change, you need to deal with the power imbalance that exists throughout the US. And boy, are we seeing it in full display right now. You must transform, and I mean transform and not tweak, the policies that we have. And so the labor movement in the United States has a proposal for something called the PRO Act that we hope to see moved, so that you have stronger unions that can address the multiple crises, the lack of power that workers face. When workers have power, let me just be clear, if you are working in a meatpacking plant, you're going to speak out that you're not in a safe working condition, or that you're being harassed, or that they're threatening. Currently, we're hearing from governors in Iowa, you're not going to have access to a vaccine if you don't have the proper documents. This is not the kind of system we can be building where workers feel safe, where women feel like they can speak out about harassment, that they can ask for health and safety protections. The other thing, and again, this is a lot to put in 3 minutes, so I just want to say we'll send in some other very concrete recommendations, is the United States does not have a national standard around how to deal with COVID. Why is this so important? This gets back to the power issue. Workers have to work. When Gabriela just spoke about the high levels of unemployment, this last week, those numbers were almost all women, not white women, but Black, Latino, Native American women. We need to make sure that if those women are looking for jobs or wanting to hold on to jobs, many of them low paid, they're safe. So another very concrete recommendation is having national standards that protect workers in the workplace, making sure all businesses are protecting workers from what's happening with COVID. And lastly, I would just say, two other ideas before I turn it over to the other panelists is, we believe the United States needs to create a task force on gender equity so that our domestic policy council can really look at equal pay policies. We need to develop an infrastructure for universal paid leave and childcare with an emphasis on racial and ethnic disparities. And we need a similar task force on racial equity. You have to look at the intersection of gender, race, migration status. That is going to be key. Let me just end again, trying to keep into the time frame, that I really congratulate UNESCO for taking this on, for working with the other UN agencies. The labor movement, both in the US and globally, has been at the forefront of creating new standards on gender-based violence. And so the last point I will make is, we have the International Labor Organization's really great framework that we all worked on, many of us, to get through Convention 190 to address and eliminate violence and harassment in the workplace. We think that framework needs to be ratified. And if not ratified, social movements like labor, like women's groups, need to organize, use that framework like the domestic workers did with Convention 189 to make it a reality in our communities. We don't need to wait for ratification. We can build power from below. So thank you. We're in it with all of you to see to the systemic change that's needed to bring about gender equality. Thanks so much.
Kathy, thank you very much. And I know you unfortunately have to leave, and we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And we're sorry we can't continue to gain from your insight right now, but we'd love to continue the conversation with you, as I'm sure we will. And lots of food for thought there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
No, it's a pleasure. Durba, could I turn to you next on this question of the main issues and stereotypes in your view in North America? I know that you've written about how deviant female sexuality has become fundamental to modern social thought. You may perhaps want to reflect on that, but it would be great to have your view on this question. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to say thanks to Kathy for those remarks. I just want to double down on everything that she said. The first thing I'll say is I'm now writing a book on the history of women of color and third world feminists who were part of UNESCO's efforts to first put gender on the agenda in feminist movements in the 1970s and 80s. And one of the things that's important for the history of UNESCO, as you all know, is that in the context of broadly of the work that UNESCO has done has been to foreground the problem of racism, and in complicated ways in the history of UNESCO, but something that I think really needs to be a priority, particularly when thinking about the North American context. I am a scholar of colonial and post-colonial context, but I work in the North American context as well. And I want to just emphasize here that it's not only about it's not simply intersectionality. I think we can see in the events of the last week that really the question of racism has to be foremost in the way that we're thinking about this thinking around gender stereotyping. The discussion, of course, as many of you have mentioned, Kathy just mentioned, is that what we see that poor women of color in the US, particularly Indigenous, Black, and Latina women are experiencing vulnerability at a level that we perhaps cannot imagine and have not, no amount of quantification is going to really capture just how extraordinarily violent this moment is for those communities. And every report, particularly around the new data related to labor, has talked about women's losses of jobs. But really, we need to think, I think for this agenda and for this work around UNESCO is disaggregating white women from women of color. I think that's a really significant element in thinking about how this framework is going to work. The second thing I would say, looking over your materials, is around gender stereotyping, is that right now your documents are completely exclusionary of trans, non-binary, or third gender peoples. And when I think about this in the context of where I study South Asia, Pakistan, India, but also in the context of the US, again, in thinking about the question of the pandemic, but more broadly about gender stereotyping, the idea of gender itself, it is striking to me to think about the combination of racism, the way racism and anti-trans, anti-queer language has come together in the last number of years in the United States by the far right. And I can think of no more vulnerable a group than trans communities, particularly trans women of color in the North American context. And so it's really striking to me that right now the language is around women. And I think one of the things that should go when you're moving forward with this is really thinking that if you're going to have an agenda that says gender stereotypes, the question of what the word gender means in that is, I think, really critical. The next thing I'll just say really quickly is around domesticity. And of course, I think COVID gives us a sense of the crisis of domesticity. And we can see that in terms of the types of household labor that women are doing that everyone has been speaking about really beautifully. The second thing I want to say is that while your documents and of course, a lot of the work has been emphasizing the violence against women, the type of violence against women that have really been exacerbated in terms of domestic violence, during the COVID pandemic, I want to just note that the global movement for Black lives and feminist activism here in the United States, but again, in the context that I work in the colonial, post-colonial world, that we need to think about domestic violence, not only in terms of the violence enacted by intimate partners, but also the types of domestic violence enacted by the state and of the police who can easily come into the home, who terrorize people and who can sometimes, abuse or kill women or kill children with impunity. And thinking about maybe in terms of gender stereotypes and the kind of representations, the kind of work that representation does, is really thinking about reframing domestic violence away from the vulnerability of an individual in an intimate partner relationship, from a man, where the state is then the person who protects women, to really rethinking the way we're framing the legal frameworks related to violence against women. And that is, I think, something that I find really striking. And this is where I've learned from scholars who are working in abolitionist feminisms and anti-carceral feminisms. And I just want to really, really bring that out, because I think right now, if we work with the old frameworks that we've seen in the last 50 years, and again, because I'm a scholar of history and looking at these UNESCO initiatives and international initiatives around gender equality, so much of that has been around punitive laws that structure women as vulnerable victim subjects. And there's no question about the extraordinary experience of violence that women have had to undergo during COVID. But I think we knew abolitionist feminists, Black abolitionisms and feminists in particular, have really given me a full understanding of the kind of restorative justice work or alternative frameworks that we need for thinking about law, that we don't need more punitive laws that create, again, that kind of perpetuate the systemic racism that is structuring North American context. But not only that, certainly across the post-colonial world as well. The punitive structure has been the primary structure for internationalist frameworks intervention around women's lives. And clearly it's not working. We've seen this for 40, 50 years, and I'm thinking here in the context of India, we need other frameworks. And that means thinking about what does gender stereotyping mean? What are ways that we can imagine women not only either as victims or agents, but also think about the representations around restorative justice, other forms of justice that don't look at punitive legal regimes. The last thing I'll just... Sorry,
so do you mind if we...
oh yeah, please, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks so much. And just to, Julie, I'd love to come to you particularly on this point that Durba just mentioned around the rethinking of legal frameworks. So kind of hold that thought. But before I do, Mishwana, I think really Durba centering this question of race and diversity and intersectionality. So Mishwana, it would be great from your perspective as a Native American and Indigenous affairs scholar for your thoughts on this question of the challenges around gender stereotypes. And then Julie, I'll bring you in thereafter.
Sikan, everybody. Well, I come to you today from the territory of Tavangnar, which is what other people know as Los Angeles, but it's the home of the Tomva people. So I just wanted to situate myself that way. And I do that as a kind of land introduction. I don't even look at it as just an acknowledgement, but I do that because that's the very problem in terms of stereotyping that Native people have, is often we're left off the statistics, often we're left off the list. It's been done a couple times already, even in this talk. And I say that and I raise that because I'm speaking here with a good mind, which means I'm speaking with the intention of trying to work towards what is the most problematic stereotype, which is often that we are not included in these discussions in important and functional ways that would change the systemic structural racism that American Indians face. Now, when I say that, and just to go off what Durba was saying a little bit, I want to throw out this definition of racism, which I think is very helpful, from Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who's one of those anti-carceral feminists that Durba was speaking to. She says that racism is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of a group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. That vulnerability to premature death. So when we're talking about American Indians, there's a particular way that nested sovereignties work within the US that is intentional. It's an architecture of white supremacy in the US that has been impacting us very severely. We recently saw the white supremacists at the Capitol. They're coming from the territories that are outside the borders of Native nations. So in some ways, I find white supremacy to be one of the most prominent ways that puts Native women and girls into danger. And this has been the case for quite some time. Now with COVID, what happens is the state-sanctioned aspect of the vulnerability that is created is done through the very structures of the US, which creates those nested sovereignties, where the IHS, the Indian Health Services, are in the Secretary of Interior. Now, I always ask my students, what else is in that Secretary of Interior? Well, that's parks, resources, and it has nothing to do with the health of a people. So we're already limited and put in those structural places of vulnerability, quite materially grounded in where our reservations are located and our resources are located. And I say this because it also sets up different waves of protection for Native people. The IHS is consistently funded at the same levels of prisons. So when we're talking even about carcerality, Native people in these areas are also overrepresented. Native women are overrepresented in some states by 400%. not Black women. When we're left off these lists, we're not addressing that. And I'm not setting that one up because I think we need to end the mass incarceration for everybody. But leaving Native people off that list, that vanishing as though we don't matter within those structural elements, is also not suiting the purposes of dealing with carcerality, dealing with systemic inequitable health conditions, etc., in the United States. So what I see is happening in terms of these nests and that structural racism of settler colonialism, that is like how the IHS itself, which has really, really been impacted by COVID. Native communities are the highest impacted people of COVID, and they're experiencing death rates at 2 times the rate of other communities. Now, I wanted to defer to one of my junior colleagues who is at the forefront of this, but she couldn't come today because she's dealing with the death of several of her tribal elders. Now we can talk about this tribal elders as well. When you lose a tribal elder that may have to be a fluent language speaker or maybe a medicine person or something like that, you're losing libraries of information, and you're losing a very important part in these close-knit, close communities. My other colleague, Jennifer Dennett-Dale, who used to be head of the rights, human nations rights in her community on Navajo, she gave a talk yesterday that I'm sure you all can find on the death rates in the Navajo Nation. So the death rates are so extreme right now because of COVID, but it's also because of the lack of healthcare, the need to travel 200 miles to get to any sort of healthcare, and some of these very large reservations are impacting greatly. So what also is happening in this is the extreme white supremacist violence around border towns is also impacting how Native people are interacting in those border town communities. When Native people have to go because we have food deserts on reservations and we have lack of healthcare, they're often more located around the border towns. Some Native people have been getting totally harassed as they do their grocery shopping, as they go to the one laundromat, and many of these other kinds of issues, which has increased those rates of violence as well. Now, another aspect that has happened in terms of thinking about the vulnerabilities of Native communities is the man camps, which has led to large rates of murder and missing Indigenous women, but that's been something that's been systemic for quite some time. As Sarah Deer lays out in her book, The Beginning and End of Rape, that's a structural maze of injustice in the US. It is very unlikely if you are raped on the reservation that you will be held, anybody will be held accountable to that rape. And that's well known. In the man camps, because of the resource-rich land that we have as Native communities, are located outside the borders of reservations. What can happen in that thing is sex trafficking occurs. And this is a long historic, again, Sarah Deer has a great article on the historic resonance of sex trafficking. So when we think about Canada and the US, we can also think about how murdered and missing Indigenous women are sex trafficked across those borders, and also Indigenous women in Mexico, which are often also not addressed in these issues, are also to the north. The Indigenous migrant detention centers in the US make it much more vulnerable for Indigenous women in those detention centers who don't have access to language translations, etc., to get healthcare. Here I recommend Shannon Speed's work, who does a great job documenting how the Indigenous migrants that are in these detention camps are not getting the attention they deserve. So I know we're going to talk about solutions later, but one of the solutions I would say very much around stereotypes and gendered stereotypes that we need to address are the fact that we have to stop leaving Native people off the statistics. We have to stop with that. And we have to address the issues of nested sovereignties and the different structures of how communities operate within the US and have that specificity addressed as well in how we're looking and working with this. Native women have been doing—
Joanna, sorry, do you mind if we, sorry to interrupt you,
sure.
We need to move on. That's fantastic, thank you. And thank you very much for putting the issue of structural racism and white supremacy on the agenda, which I would like to return to. Julie, over to you. We spoke previously about kind of your work in relation to gender-based violence and law, and listening just to what Joanna said and what Durba said. Would love your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much for this panel. I am honored to be on the panel with all of you, and thank you for the opening remarks. I mean, there's so much I could just echo in what's been said by others, and I don't want to take the time to repeat what others have said, other than to highlight a few things. One is, I completely agree that we can't look at the relationship between gender stereotypes and gender violence in particular without looking at the history, particularly in the United States, which is where my work focuses on structural and historic racism. And that includes anti-Black racism, as well as racism against immigrants, xenophobia, racism against Native people, which of course is at the core of our country. So I really think you can't disaggregate that both in your analysis and in understanding of solutions. And I think it's only by centering those experiences that we can come up with solutions that will go any distance toward solving these problems, because as others have said, we've been working on these issues for decades now and have seen progress, but we have so far to go. And I think this is a particular moment where we're seeing the pain and the culmination of our failure to address the structural inequalities. So I'll do two things. One is just want to add a few issues. We've heard a lot about economics, which I completely agree is so foundational to our understanding about gender violence. We've mentioned healthcare, which also is so important. And recently we've seen in the United States the forced sterilizations of women in immigrant detention centers. So we see the coalescing of those issues. And underlying stereotypes underlie all of those harms. I guess a couple of things I would point out, very much agree about broadening the lens from a focus on women to a focus on gender stereotypes. I think the more we infuse that kind of understanding and look at the role of gender nonconformity, the role of our policies and the impact of our policies on LGBT and trans people, particularly trans women of color. I really echo what Derba says about that, has said about that. And I would add that it's important for us to focus on accountability. Our common notions of accountability over the years overwhelmingly has been synonymous with criminal legal interventions. And I'm also indebted to the work of abolition feminists, particularly Black abolitionist feminists, in highlighting and bringing to public attention the limitations and the harm that this focus on criminal legal interventions has produced. So many people are beginning to turn their attention to, as Derba mentioned, restorative approaches. And I would add to that, and hope we could come back to this later, just to say that if we really step back and look at our public messaging around gender violence, so much of it focuses on duality, focuses on the idea of a perpetrator and a victim. So much of it focuses on some idea that criminal legal intervention will solve the problem. We measure success by measuring the number of convictions, the number of arrests, when really, if we step back, we would see that those criminal legal interventions don't solve the problem. Rather, if we devoted resources, and this may get into solutions, which I know we'll come back to later, but if we devoted anywhere near the resources that we in the United States in particular, but not limited to the United States, have put into our criminal legal apparatus and put it into bolstering civil society, economics, childcare, decent wages, housing, education. I could go on, and I'm sure you all know the list. We might imagine a very different world, and we might imagine a very different landscape in terms of gender equality generally, and specifically with respect to gender violence. I could say more, but
Julie, thank you very much. And I already see that kind of an interesting kind of similarity across our responses, particularly around kind of questions of restorative processes and our understanding of justice, that I would love us to return to. Last but definitely not least, Umberto, would like to turn to you on this question of stereotypes. Joanna mentioned the question of structural racism or white supremacy. One of the things that we haven't talked about so far in this conversation is white male patriarchy. And in a way, I think, Joanna, I felt like, and others, that what we saw represented in the US Capitol last week, in a way, wasn't just, you know, white supremacy, it was particularly white male patriarchy. And so as we think about this conversation, I know your work, Umberto, on engaging men and boys, would be delighted if you have any particular thoughts on how that intersection of racism and kind of patriarchy perhaps manifest themselves in ways that we need to be cognizant of.
Absolutely, Tim, and thanks to you for moderating this panel, to Gabrielle and Anne-Marie and UNESCO colleagues for bringing us all together, and to my fellow panelists who have been really amazing and who I can truly stand in solidarity with everything that you've said. Just in terms of my perspective and where I come from, working with an organization that works on the front lines of engaging men and boys in preventing gender-based violence, in promoting healthy masculinities and promoting gender equality, and encouraging men to be allies and stand in solidarity. I would say that we need to look at this from multiple intersections, right? So we need to work in the systems change and policy change, but we also need to work on changing individual minds and hearts and thinking, as Gabriella encouraged us to think about at the beginning as well. So those intersections are important. You know, we need to use an intersectional, decolonizing, anti-oppression approach to this work, and we must consider the role of men and boys in this, not just as perpetrators of this inequality, of racism, of colonization, of misogyny, of homophobia and transphobia, and so many other inequalities, but also as potential allies and potential agents of change, working together with women's organizations, racial justice organizations, and social justice organizations, with indigenous communities, to bring about the equality that we need and to put an end to this violence and to this oppression. So we also need, in order to do that, we need to understand the root causes of this violence and this inequality. We know that they are rooted in patriarchy and the history of centuries of colonization, of racism, of oppression. That is clear. Nobody can question that, although many do, and we have to work on that as well. But we also need to understand the impacts that the current pandemic and the way that the boys and young men are socialized in this culture of patriarchy and systemic discrimination. We, as our panelists have mentioned, we know and we understand the disproportionate impact that this has had on women, on Black communities, racialized immigrant and refugee communities, LGBTQ communities, indigenous women and girls, youth, and so many more. We know that there are higher rates of online sexual exploitation and trafficking of young women and girls, and we know that home is not a safe place for so many women and children and LGBTQ community members, because sheltering at home with a man who's abusive and violent will put them at higher risk for further violence, harassment, and exploitation. We also know that men's traditional perception of themselves as providers and protectors of the family may be negatively impacted, and women may find themselves increasing their family-related workloads. And this has everything to do with stereotypes, and now I'm referring to stereotypes at the individual level in terms of impact on behaviors and attitudes, of course. We know that men are more likely to turn to alcohol and other high-risk behaviors, including the use of violence, to relieve pandemic-induced stress, frustration, and anxiety. We know that this stems from men's inability to be fully aware of their emotions and to employ healthy ways of addressing pain and loss and frustration and stress. We know that combination of personal and employment loss, financial hardship, and uncertainty are factors in the increased use of violence by men within the family and the community. And this helps to aggravate those feelings of loss of control among men, who then resort to increasing their authority at home. We know that men who adhere to rigid traditional masculine gender norms tend to condone and commit higher levels of gender-based violence, while men who are aware of their privilege may be less likely to use control and violence in their relationships. And that perhaps speaks to one of the solutions. We need to work with men to understand that they have privilege, to understand the impacts of that disproportionate privilege, their disproportionate use of power. And we need to help them understand the impact that that has on individuals, on community, and on our society as a whole, and help them understand what they can do to play a different kind of role, one that's much more equitable, that leads to a society in the future where there is less violence, where there are more equal opportunities for all, where there is greater representation of women and historically underrepresented groups in our positions of leadership, in our institutions of leadership in politics and so forth. So thank you, and I look forward to saying a few more words later on.
Great, thank you very much, all of you. We've kind of jumped back and forth between kind of issues and challenges, solutions, sorry, which has been great. And I just want to remind people who are listening to please, and I see some of you already have, to put your questions in the Q&A box, and also to share in the chat function any thoughts that you've got on this conversation and any kind of solutions or that you have. I just want to return to the panelists kind of one last time before we open up, and just ask you very quickly, and maybe I'll begin with you, Umberto, if it's okay, and then we'll go in the opposite direction. What do you think? So I think maybe you encapsulated it there, but given the range of challenges that we've talked about, if there's kind of one key solution that you really feel we need to think about, especially in the context of kind of changing mindsets and kind of challenging stereotypes, which is the key aspect to this work, and the key to kind of UNESCO's mandate also as it thinks about gender equality. What would be the kind of the key solution that you see currently being implemented or you're aware of kind of in North America?
Yeah, thank you, Tim, for that question. And I would continue on with my point that men must be part of the solution. And we must step forwards and learn how to counter some of these systemic inequities and discriminations. We need to educate ourselves. We need to learn better coping mechanisms, and we need to understand that we can be positive role models for the young people in our lives, in our communities, and we have a role to play in addressing our peers who are engaging in discriminatory, violent, and harassing type of behaviors, and encourage them instead to be equitable in their interactions with everyone. We need to understand the role that we can play in ending racism, homophobia, transphobia, colonialism, and all forms of discrimination. We need to engage this from an intersectional point of view. And the organizations that are working in this field need to take that into consideration as well. So primary prevention, engaging men and boys as allies in solidarity with accountability. That's key, I think, in this work. Accountability, making sure that we don't lose sight of the end goal, which is true equality amongst all genders and inclusion of all peoples. And so we need in that call to use a stronger gender-based analysis to this work. We need to go deeper, even deeper than that, and look at the various roles that people can play, and call men to the fore, and ask them, invite them to play a different role than perhaps we have over history, and work side by side with those who are working towards change.
Great, thank you. Jorba, could I come back to you, and especially on this question of, you presented a number of challenges, particularly around intersectionality, which we've spoken about. Several people have now spoken about on the panel. What's the key solution that you currently see being implemented, or you see emerging within North America that may give us hope as we think about shifting mindsets and challenging gender stereotypes?
Sorry, it's the word hope is something that's a little difficult to think about right now, and not in a crude way, but I think that many of the things that Professor Goldshield brought up and Professor Goldman brought up were really important, which is that I think more visible than ever is a kind of real orientation after many decades of people putting money towards punitive structures, that I think that there's a broader conversation right now about a restructuring, a kind of fundamental institutional restructuring that needs to happen around funding structures. And so one of the things that Kathy mentioned when she was, was that we need a gender equity, commission, and we need a racism commission. And I think, sometimes that those structures are important and we need policy commissions, but we need other ways of thinking. And I think that one of the things that Professor Goldman has brought out is that the problem with gender stereotyping is that there's actually disappearance. There's, in fact, in Native communities, and this is so much of the work of so many wonderful scholars, of feminist scholars, is that, disappearance means that there's not a stereotype, it's just absence, right? And so I think the question is, what is it that we can do to create new opportunities for visibility and structure visibility and create new language? And I think that there's a new language. That's one thing that Kathy did mention, is that in the different, we see this in different generations, and Gabriella also mentioned this. There's a new generation of young people who have a different imagination of what they imagine institutions to do. And I think we have to use that energy to reimagine what institutions are going to be in a broader sense. I know that's conceptual, but I think that the gender stereotyping means that we no longer use just language like laws of violence against women. We need to use different language to begin to think about changing those structures from within.
Great, thank you very much. And Julie, could I bring you in here? One of the things that kind of excites me about this conversation is this focus on kind of the kind of restructuring or reimagining of our legal responses and I think accountability. At the same time, kind of mindful of UNESCO's mandate and their real kind of drive and focus on shifting mindsets. How do we reimagine the way in which we deal with violence against women in a way that really is not only about different legal response, but is fundamentally about shifting the very way in which we understand gender-based violence and really address those root causes that Umberto spoke to that are ultimately at kind of underpin the very violence we see in our streets, in our communities, in our homes in North America every day.
Yes, and thank you for that. And I think you're so right that we're seeing that in high relief given the events of the past week down in DC. Two touchstones for me are the ideas of accountability and prevention. So I so appreciate what Umberto was talking about in his programming around working with young men and boys to dismantle ideas, traditional ideas that are still so prevalent about about our gender roles. So I think if we really thought more carefully and in a more nuanced way about what accountability means, that could really open doors. And this is where what I was saying earlier about the way that we have conceived of gender violence in a dualistic way, perpetrator-victim, when what we know is that most people who commit violence have been subjected to violence. And we've done relatively so little to interrogate and to investigate, to research and to publicize what we can do to interrupt violence, to stop it. That's why I'm so appreciative, Umberto, of your remarks and you and your organization's work and others who are doing similar work. That's where, to the extent that laws have focused on punitive measures, instead we might focus on what repair really means. And that's one of the foundational tenets of restorative approaches. What do survivors really want? We so rarely ask that question, whether it's in the context of sexual assault between strangers, sexual assault within families, or sexual assault and sexual harassment at work. You look at the data and the studies of sexual harassment in the workplace, to take just one really important example. example. And there is relatively no data on what people subjected to harassment want. There's an assumption that survivors want people punished. There's an assumption that people want survivors criminally punished. That may well be true in some cases, but particularly, and just to take the example of sexual harassment as but one example, where you have people who work in the same communities, to fire, say, someone who has committed sexual harassment is really just to leave them to go on and to harass others in another workplace. So, you know, I think that UNESCO could play a really important role and in shifting our assumptions about what solutions we turn to as an initial matter, and to think much more about prevention, about centering the experiences and the goals and the priorities of those who are subjected to gender and other forms of structural violence and discrimination. And that might open up the door to imagining very different types of solutions.
Great, thank you very much for that. Mishwana, can I turn to you on this? Oh, sorry, Julie, do you mind if we...
Just one quick point. I just think public health framings have been really helpful in shifting behavior and common understandings. And I think to bring in public health modeling to this whole conversation could be really helpful. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I must apologize also, Julie, that I described you as coming from SUNY University rather than City University, which I apologize for.
Thank you. CUNY, yeah, thank you.
Mishwana, can I bring you in on this question of solutions? Thank you, everyone, for the great questions that have come in so far. And we're going to turn to those questions just in a moment, but please keep them coming. Mishwana, what would you say, reflecting on what's been said, and I think the really important points that you made before, and I'm sorry we had to kind of cut off some of those really powerful points, in terms of what key solution, and you know, if we can be hopeful in the midst of, and I totally get this point, so but in the midst of the challenges we face, what would you kind of put on the table as what you see or what you kind of perceive as emerging?
So there's a couple things, one specific to Native communities, and that is recognizing our treaties, and that includes both in Canada and the US, recognizing treaty and recognizing Native lands. And that's like the accountability. What are our accountabilities? Treaties are living things. So this has to be how there are living relationships between the settler state and Native nations. And we have to begin to start to recognize those and understanding that for what it is. And by doing so, we could restructure the inequitability between different spaces. Now, I think since over 68% of the Native population lives in cities, there also has to be a change in those kind of structural places. I look at the difference between where I live in LA and where a majority of Black Latinx, I don't like to drive, so I live close to UCLA, but in the other part of Los Angeles, the differences in the structuring of that space, such as access to food, living quarters, etc., all of this is really impacting our public health right now. And we can see the mass inequity in how we think of the spatial in relation to that. So I guess when I see we need to do less damage-centered research on communities of color and actually look at what is structurally enabling the health disparities, the labor disparities, and also the less justice and less oversight of who's going to be vulnerable to sexual violence or domestic violence or any of those sorts of issues. We have to begin to think a little more critically about the structural, and that structural also comes through education. So U.S. education on American Indians is really, really, really bad. So I'll leave it. I'll try to be short this time.
Great, thank you all very much indeed. So we've had a number of questions, and thank you again to everyone for that. A reminder that we will come back to the panel for your final recommendations, and also please, everyone do share your recommendations on what specifically UNESCO could do in this context. And I feel that this is a kind of conversation that we could have for another hour and a half or more, and it's been thrilling. Thank you. I think to pick up on a couple of things, and then I'll let the panel decide, you know, or choose what it would specifically like to focus on. So I think one thing, and this is especially important to UNESCO, is the question of role models, and especially the issue around male role models and how do we engage with role models, what role can they play, how could role models be a game changer would be interesting for thoughts on that, and particularly Umberto, I'd appreciate if you could speak to that. I think also, you know, I think there's broader question around donor funding and the kind of priorities of donors and the voices of grassroots organizations, grassroots women's organizations in kind of priorities and the way in which this work is undertaken. How do we engage with those who set the priorities at the kind of more structural level to have a greater focus on this issue? A couple of comments around the workplace, which folks may wish to kind of pick up on. A question around, you know, is paid leave, you know, part of the solution? How do we shift the workplace norms? Kathy, unfortunately, you know, had to leave, but, you know, is there a role? Could we reimagine the gender roles between men and women, and you know, and the fact that as we see how gender inequality has so significantly impact on women, both in terms of paid work and unpaid work, and you know, and not to mention the broader challenges of violence. So, is there a way in which we might reimagine men and women's roles in society as an opportunity for moving forward and changing and challenging gender stereotypes? And I think finally, overall, the sense that this is deep rooted. You know, this is really a challenge for us all. You know, education in particular was flagged by some participants and has just been mentioned, Mishwana, by you. But you know, how really do we begin to get at these deep roots? I think this is really the crux of what we're trying to change. We've talked about structural racism. We've talked about the problematic systems. We've talked about the fact that, you know, part of gender stereotyping is the very fact that certain groups are missing it. Begin to reimagine a more equal and less gender stereotypical and more empowering and inclusive world. Who would like to go first on those small questions for a better world?
Sometimes,
please, Michelle, sorry.
Joba, go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say something very small, which is that in a recent editorial, my colleague, Professor Evelyn Hammond, said that if we do not begin to deal with the crisis that is COVID right now, an entire generation of scientific communities, but also just more generally scholarly communities, will risk losing an entire generation of talented women in scholarly worlds, in professional worlds. And one of the things that she says that I think is brilliant is we do not need a report written years from now bemoaning the loss. So I just want to say really quickly, we don't want a report from UNESCO in 10 years that says there's a huge loss from 10 years ago of a generation of women, of minority women in particular, of women of color who are educated and are therefore kept out of educational systems and structures because of the COVID crisis, which is what we're seeing now. Women are dropping out of education, where women are dropping out of workplaces, professional workplaces. And I just want to say, if you want to talk about role models and thinking about role models, I think the greatest crisis of COVID in that sense, and thinking about role models, is that there will be an entire generation of women who will disappear. And I just want to mention that really quickly.
Great, thank you. Juliet, I think you were trying to come in there, is that right?
I can, although I thought Mishwana, were you trying
sorry,
were you jumping in?
Mishwana, do you want to jump in?
I just wanted to address the issue of education, as I feel like that has been a road for many to move from poverty and on. So I'm very pro-education, I'm an educator, but at the same time, we also have to recognize the violence of education and what that has done, particularly in Indigenous communities. Many trace the first stem of violence. The Boarding School Healing Project did this in Canada, when they traced the first hints of violence in their family tree, it stems from the boarding school process and the sexual violence and physical violence and the medical experimentation that Sarah Jane McKellen has really worked on. It has stemmed from that. So the distrust with education, and as a parent and as somebody who went through the education system, my two children didn't face that much difference in how they felt as an American Indian child, erased with a complete violent history in their history classes that kind of whitewashed the violence of the US. My daughter had to argue that we were sovereign nations. She's better versed in federal Indian law than most of her professors or teachers and professors, I will say. So I think we also have to address the violence of education. And recently I was trying to find the link, but there is educators working on what happened on the Capitol Hill, like how to teach if you're a white teacher of Black students, how to teach if you're a Black teacher of Black students. So sometimes we kind of flatten educators and who's teaching and how we should teach and how it should work out, when we really have to think about what is the makeup of our classrooms, who is teaching in these classrooms, how does it work. Sandy Grande's work is very much about, and education is very much trying to teach specifically to again, I guess it gets back to the racist structures. Sometimes you have classrooms where there's not representations of the students themselves, and that can be very impactful of those classrooms. So I agree that education can be the answer. Is it there yet? No, because in my experience, especially in K through 12 in the US and in Canada, in many ways, it's violent. Education is violent, and we also have to address that. So.
Great, thank you very much. Julie, would you like to come in?
Sure, thank you for that. And one thing it made me think is that, with any particular intervention, like education, for example, it's not the fact of intervention, but it's of the intervention, it's how we do it. And one thing it makes me think about is, a lot of people are talking about equity audits. And I think that can be a powerful tool, whenever you're thinking about a policy intervention, whether it's a law or a policy, to incorporate a direction to stop and think about what the impact will be of that intervention on the communities that are most marginalized. And that can just be a way to ensure at least an awareness about what the ramifications will be, and potentially a backstop to provide some course correction and make sure that it's the community, the people in the communities that are historically underserved who are most helped. Leadership is really important, and we're just seeing Exhibit A in what's happening in our country, in the United States right now. And so, to the extent, maybe I'll try to, it's hard, I agree with what Derba said, it's hard to muster the word hope at this moment, but to the extent that all the destruction and devastation does lead to some opportunity for change, I think and hope that different role modeling from leadership at the top at every level can produce some shifts.
Great.
Just a few quick words on two issues: education and role modeling, building on what has already been shared. I think men in particular have an important role to play as positive role models. Women do as well, people of all genders. I grew up with violence in my home, and it was the women in the community, in my wider family, and women in women's organizations who were tremendously supportive of me along the way, and who helped me reach where I am today and do this kind of work. So let's not underestimate the importance of role modeling from people of all genders, but in particular men, because the predominant amount of violence that's committed against women against people of non-binary genders is committed by men. So men have a responsibility and a key role to play in helping to raise new generations of young people, boys, girls, young people of all genders that are much more socially and gender equitable, that believe in peaceful approaches to relationships, that believe in equality and equity, and believe in redressing the inequalities of the past and building a better future. So that's important. And I think men can come forward and can be, after doing their own work in terms of addressing their own past mistakes and ensuring that their attitudes and behaviors of present are part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Men have an important role to play in that respect, and do women and folks of all genders in being role models for young people around them. The education system is important, and yes, we do have to address those systemic changes. They're needed, they're sorely needed. White Ribbon has been doing a lot of work with educator groups here in Ontario and in Canada to embed gender-based violence prevention, healthy relationships, healthy sexualities into the curriculum. And that's key, that's needed, that needs to happen concurrently with those broader systemic changes. And educators can be key allies in this as well. So let's see them as partners and work with them as partners as well in affecting this kind of change. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you all. So we've only got a couple of minutes left until we unfortunately wrap up. Would like to say to the 103 people who have kind of joined us, it's gone up while we've been talking. So obviously that's a good sign that our conversation has increased more participation. Please do share on the chat. We're moving to recommendations about what specifically should UNESCO do. And I'm going to come back to each of the panelists as we think about UNESCO's role in its new flagship program on gender stereotypes. What one or two things should be a priority for UNESCO? How can it build on what's already happening? How can it support that work? And how can UNESCO use the power of its networks and of its country support and the fantastic colleagues that you have from UNESCO on this call under Gabriela and Anna Maria's leadership to advance this issue. So everybody on the chat, please provide your recommendations now. You've got about 5 minutes to do that. We would be thrilled for your inputs on what should UNESCO specifically do. UNESCO can't do everything. It would like to fix the world, but that's everyone's responsibility. But we're certainly keen to work with everyone to advance this cause. So back to the speakers for their closing remarks. I just want to say how much I've enjoyed this conversation and how inspired and I am listening to all of you and to the critically important work that you do. So thank you for that, and thank you for your remarks, and would appreciate both your key recommendations to UNESCO and any closing contributions that you have. We've only got 4 minutes left, so please keep your remarks to under 1 minute. Should we start with Julie?
1 minute is really hard. I think that public education is really powerful, and it seems to me that UNESCO is well positioned to highlight themes. And so I love the work that you all have done and are doing about unpacking and challenging gender stereotypes. I think that public service announcements can embellish those themes. I think recommending things like national action plans, prevention programs, investment in communities, education, economics, and really looking at meaningful accountability. And that includes both a nuanced understanding of what accountability means on an individual level, and also mechanisms for accountability for state violence, which is something I meant to mention earlier that doesn't get enough attention.
Great, thank you. Umberto.
Yeah, well, my key recommendation is continue to engage with men and boys, continue to partner with organizations in the women's movement, in the diverse social justice movements consider the disproportionate impacts of this discrimination and violence on Indigenous communities, on Black communities, on racialized immigrant and newcomer communities, apply an anti-oppression, intersectional, gender transformative approach, in particular to the engagement of men and boys, and help build the evidence, help build the body of work that already exists in North America and around the world. There's a lot of really great organizations applying great approaches that are working. If only we could scale it up, and if only we had the right resources to do this at a level that brings about much greater impact. So UNESCO has an opportunity to help change the landscape in that respect. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Durba?
Thank you again for this opportunity. And I really want to say thank you to the panelists, because I've learned a lot from all of you. I have, recommendations. The first thing I would say is, again, I just want to emphasize again the need to consult specifically trans rights and third gender or other gender experts to think about the category gender and the Gender Stereotypes initiative, and making that a real priority in the way that the agenda moves forward, because of the complexity and politicization of those particular categories in our contemporary world. The second thing I would say is thinking about different genres. One of the things I've learned from the history of UNESCO is that we produce a lot of reports. We produce a lot of reports which go into recommendations. And I wonder if there might be a way to pair with other community activists or the community work to produce children's books, or to create funding structures to create other genres, that music, song, other forms that might create a new conversation about the kind of work that UNESCO does, because it's an educational and cultural institution. And then the third thing I would just say is that in the Gender Stereotyping initiative, in the Stereotype initiative, employ people of color, women of color, and people from Indigenous communities and from the Global South. Not simply as experts to consult with, but employed within the organization so that it regularly informs the work that's being done in this initiative. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Mishwana?
I have to concur with Durba. That's a lot of what I had thought, like to structurally put in experts from those communities from the very start, and having listening sessions of the communities with what you're working. And this can lead to developing non-damage centered research and non-damage centered materials, so that it's not pathologizing in that sense, but rather putting forth a positive perspective for American Indians, for instance. Living cultures and living treaties and living peoples is key to that, and not something that's always a pathology of the poor Indian victimology, but rather there's beautiful children's literature out right now, and there's lots of resources and sites that are wonderful. And so really assessing what's working and what's not, but asking the community to assess that work is always key, I think. So I'll end there.
Great, thank you all very much. A kind of virtual round of applause to everyone and to the panel. Thank you very much, everyone. Just a couple of closing remarks. I noticed that there's a number of people from other regions of the world who've joined this conversation, and thank you, people from Europe, people from Africa. There was a question I noticed about why there wasn't kind of African representation on the panel, so I just wanted to emphasize to everybody that there are going to be a number of other consultations around the globe, and the information on those is being shared in the chat function as we speak. So please do participate. The one for the Arab region is coming up this week, and then each region of the world will be represented. So please take part in that, and the times are there. Please also complete the questionnaire that's about to be circulated. We'd love to keep in touch with you. We'd love to find out what you thought of this conversation, and to continue engaging with you as part of the new initiative from UNESCO. So thank you, everybody. It's been a thoroughly enjoyable conversation. I just want to say thanks once again to our stunning panelists, Julie, Umberto, Mishwana, and Durba and Kathy, who had to leave us early. Thank you very much to Gabriela for her opening remarks, and to the UNESCO team, and to everyone who's made this possible. Do stay safe, take care, remain hopeful, and thanks everyone for fantastic insights. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you at the forthcoming regional consultations, and please do share those with your colleagues who are working elsewhere around the globe, and let's stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone.